Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth event in the U.S. Asia Institute's Southeast Asia in Focus series. My name is Zev Moses, and I'm the Director of International and Government Affairs at the U.S. Asia Institute. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations-affiliated nonprofit with a 41-year track record of building, understanding, and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Just to get us started with a quick housekeeping note, the last 10 or 15 minutes or so of today's briefing will allow time for questions from the audience. If you have a question you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time. You could also directly chat me if you would like to, or if you're calling in by phone, you could email usai@usasiainstitute.org. I'd also like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping make this program possible. That's Las Vegas Sands, Merck, AIG, Airbnb, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, and Walmart. To give you a broad overview of this initiative, Southeast Asia in Focus is a series of standalone briefings that examine key issues and topics in the US relationship with specific Southeast Asian nations. We have hosted sessions focusing on broader U.S. Southeast Asia trade goals, Indonesia's energy sector, and the Biden administration's Southeast Asia policy. This series will continue throughout the year with webinars focusing on technology, human rights, climate change, and more. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion on maritime security issues. Michael Swain is the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute and a foremost scholar on Chinese security studies. Michael previously worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he specialized in Chinese defense and foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and East Asian international affairs. He also spent time as a senior analyst at the RAND Corporation and has authored and edited over a dozen books. We're very happy to have him and his expertise with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Michael.
Great, thanks very much, Zev. Really appreciate it, and I'm really happy to be here moderating this event today, this important event. As Zev said, I'm the director of the East Asia program at the newly created Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which focuses on the greater use of diplomacy and restraint in US foreign policy and the use of our military only as a last resort, and an overall lowered military profile for the US across the world. Today, we're going to be talking about Southeast Asia and the South China Sea disputes. These are obviously major issues for the countries in the region and a major issue for the United States, considering its long-standing relationship and its contacts and presence in Asia. And of course, perhaps the major aspect of US concerns over this issue involve the implications of China's growing presence in and policies towards the South China Sea. In recent years, as you probably know, Beijing has strengthened its control over the Paracel Islands in the north in the South China Sea, created several large artificial islands among the Spratly Islands in the south, increased its overall presence in the area through Coast Guard and maritime militia operations, and more robustly asserted highly questionable historical rights across the area, while yet failing to define what its famous 9-dash line across most of the South China Sea is intended to signify. It's also rejected the findings of a 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling relating to maritime, albeit not territorial, maritime rights in the South China Sea. Now, it hasn't threatened commercial transit in the South China Sea, but it clearly regards many foreign military activities by extra-regional powers, and especially the United States, as destabilizing. And it has strong strategic interests in protecting its military assets in southern China, including on Hainan Island. Today's briefing is intended to give you a fuller picture of many of these issues at play, insights into the motivations and actions of some of the key players, especially China, and some comments on how the US can work with these nations to adapt to emerging threats and seek to resolve tensions. Now, we're very fortunate today to have with us three top experts on these issues to lead this briefing. First, I'd like to welcome my colleague at QI, Dr. Rachel Esplin-Odell, who will set the stage on this issue and offer her insights. Rachel's a research fellow in the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute, where she focuses on U.S. strategy toward Asia, Chinese foreign policy, and maritime disputes. Her writings have appeared in prominent publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Diplomat. And notably, for today's discussion, she's received the Alexander George Award from the Foreign Policy Analysis section of the International Studies Association for her research on the relationship between maritime power and international law. And by the way, she wrote her PhD dissertation for MIT on this subject. Next up speaking will be Alexander Vuving, who will focus on Chinese behavior and pathways for possible de-escalation. Dr. Vuving is a professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, a Defense Department institute based in Hawaii. His research interests cut across international relations, comparative politics, and historical sociology. His major areas of research range from functional topics such as the sources of state behavior, the making of grand strategic change, and the workings of soft power, to regional issues such as Asian security, the rise of China, and even Vietnamese politics, very broad. He's been published in major scholarly journals and presented at leading universities and think tanks around the world. Last but not least among our three presenters is Greg Poling, who will delve more deeply into the activities of the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia and offer some thoughts on current policies from Manila and Washington. Greg is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's a well-known expert on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, particularly on maritime issues, South China Sea, Southeast Asia, and his writings consistently appear in various journals such as Foreign Affairs and various newspapers. You can read more about Greg, Alex, and Rachel in the program for this event. Now, on today's briefing, the format, each of our speakers will make prepared remarks to be no longer than 15 minutes each. Don't make me ring the gong, followed by a brief discussion among the three that I will moderate, and then the final 10 to 15 minutes will be open for audience Q&A, as Zev said. So with that, let's begin. Rachel, would you please take it away?
Yes, thanks very much for the introduction, and I'm looking forward to this event today. I wanted to begin by just giving an introduction to what it is that is at stake in the South China Sea, what are the disputes that are involved in the region, and how the United States, what role the United States plays in those disputes. So to begin, I'm going to share my screen and give a bit of a geographical overview of what we mean when we're talking about the South China Sea. Okay. Here we go. So this is the South China Sea in Google Earth, and I will zoom out a little bit here. So you can see, of course, this is China up here. We have Vietnam, also sort of ringing the South China Sea, Philippines on the other side. Here's Taiwan. Down here we have Malaysia and Brunei, and then of course Indonesia. And these are also Indonesian islands in this vicinity, the Natuna Islands. So these are the main, and then of course here's the rest of Southeast Asia, but these are the main countries that border the South China Sea. And most of these countries also lay claim to a number of small and mostly uninhabited land features in the South China Sea. And these can be sort of divided into a few different groupings. I'll zoom in on these. In the north, we have what are commonly known, there we go. What are commonly known as the Paracel Islands in English. Of course, these different countries have different terms for them in their own languages. And then in the south, we have a group of a few hundred land features. That's the Spratly Islands. And then there's a feature over here in the east known as Scarborough Shoal. And then there are various other submerged features that are never above water, reefs and whatnot, besides these three main groups. Well, in Scarborough, it's not part of a group, it's sort of a standalone shoal or reef there. But I'll focus on just providing a little bit of history on the disputes over these three sets of features. So the countries that I previously mentioned all lay claim to some combination of these features, except for Indonesia, which doesn't actually claim sovereignty over any of these land features, but it still gets involved in these disputes to some extent due to some of China's claims, which I'll talk about. But the history of these disputes really, in many ways, although many of these countries sort of trace it back into eons past, it really begins in the early 1970s. When, of course, there had been previous disputes and some occupation of these islands, but for the most part, these islands had been unoccupied except for some Taiwan occupation in the Paracel Islands when it was, as Republic of China, and then but starting in the early 1970s, sorry, PRC was up in the Paracels and Taiwan was down in Ituwaba, which is in the Spratlys. But starting in the 1970s, the United Nations did a survey of hydrocarbon resources in the South China Sea. And this was during a time of great ferment in the law of the sea, international law of the sea more generally, when countries were making larger claims to resources, to fish, and to undersea, to seabed oil and gas resources on the basis of zones extending from land. So the ways to sort of make claims to these resources were to be able to extend those claims from land features, which of course really raised the value of what had previously been considered relatively, insignificant islands in these areas. And so these, in the early 1970s, you had countries moving in to occupy some of these reefs. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and just get a little bit more of the history here, where in approximately 1970 to 1971, the Philippines moved into 5 smaller islands and reefs in the Spratlys, which is that southern group, followed by Vietnam occupying 6 islands in 1973. And then as each country was really trying to bolster their claims to seabed resources in the surrounding areas, the Philippines and Vietnam then occupied several more features in the 1980s, when Malaysia also staked a claim to 12 features in the southern Spratlys and occupied several of them. The PRC government in China objected to these occupations and eventually established its own presence in the Spratlys with occupations of 6 features in 1988 and another in 1994. So that's the sort of the history of the Spratlys disputes, is really that all these different governments claimed sovereignty over these islands, but their salience really started to increase over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. And then in the Paracel Islands, which were the dispute that's further up in the north, those are mostly a dispute between China and Vietnam. And one quick note I'll just mention here is that all the claims that China makes are essentially made by both the People's Republic of China and on mainland China and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And Taiwan, this is especially relevant because the largest island in the Spratlys, Ituwaba, is in fact occupied and controlled by Taiwan, by the Republic of China. Whereas the Paracels are today occupied by the People's Republic of China. And after a naval battle with Vietnam in 1974, they've consolidated control over all of those Paracel Islands, but Vietnam still claims sovereignty over those. And then lastly, Scarborough Shoal is not physically, there's no physical presence on Scarborough Shoal. It's over there in the sort of northeastern portion of the South China Sea. But after 2012, China has established a degree of sort of administrative control in that vicinity after a sort of encounter with the Philippines and that resulted in effective Chinese control in the area. So these disputes really are, the United States hasn't traditionally taken a position on the sovereignty of, who actually has rightful sovereignty over these land features. They're mostly, as I mentioned, unoccupied. They're mostly uninhabited, except for the islands that have been occupied are sort of, they're inhabited by mostly government forces as well as some civilian forces that the government sort of maintains and supports. And so the United States hasn't traditionally taken a position on which countries have rightful sovereignty here. However, over the last decade or so, as these disputes have heated up, it's become more complicated. And one of the ways in which it's become most complicated is that there's a lot of disagreements among these countries over exactly who should get the resources that are around these islands. And in particular, who should have jurisdiction to enforce their rights and interests in the waters around these islands. And these disputes don't just stem from the fact that they disagree over the underlying sovereignty over those islands, but also that they disagree over the international law of the sea that governs maritime resources extending from those islands. So here's where I will just pull up the map again to illustrate a few of these points and just why this is an ongoing source of dispute among the countries involved. So as we can see up here in the Paracel Islands, under the law of the sea, if an island is of a sort of certain degree of significance and size, you can claim a 200-mile exclusive economic zone surrounding a land feature. And this, of course, is the case with mainland features as well. So countries can claim up to 200 miles of where they can claim all of the resources within those waters for themselves. And when there's overlap, then there's certain principles governing how countries are supposed to equitably divide those resources. But of course, in a crowded environment like the South China Sea, this becomes very complicated, as 200 miles is approximately, this is from 200 miles from the Vietnam coast would be, approximately out to this vicinity. So if you can imagine drawing 200-mile, EEZs around all of these features, and there's a lot of overlap. So one of the key questions is which of these features should be entitled to an exclusive economic zone, if any, and then whoever would has rights to those exclusive economic zones would be able to then control the fisheries and other resources there. But this becomes even more complicated when the Chinese government also makes a claim to not just the individual islands and the resources surrounding them in 200 nautical miles, but also draws straight baselines, and I will X those out for a moment, draws straight baselines around these islands, which means that they draw lines to enclose all of the islands and claim the waters within those lines as internal waters, and then they use those as the baselines for claiming territorial seas and exclusive economic zones. And this is a contested practice under international law that this 2016 arbitration ruling that Michael referred to has rejected as, as not a legitimate practice. And China has drawn straight baselines around the paracels represented by these red lines. They have not drawn straight baselines in the Spratlys. However, they do treat the Spratlys as a unit, and they've reserved that right to draw those baselines in the future. So what this means is that China's claims are actually quite ambiguous, because on one hand, it claims sovereignty over all these land features, and it claims the relevant maritime zones around them. But since it hasn't even drawn its baselines in the South China Sea, we don't really know what the extent of its claims are. And then another feature of this is that, as Michael alluded to, China also claims historic rights in the region. Now, the historic rights in the South China Sea. Now, there are such a thing as historic rights in customary international law, where if countries have traditionally exercised a certain type of activity in part of the ocean, then and they've done that historically over a prolonged period of time without objection from other countries, then that can be the basis for a right. However, it's fairly limited, and China's claim to historic rights in the whole South China Sea is a pretty exceptional and extreme version of this historic rights claim. Moreover, it hasn't really been, they haven't made that claim for a prolonged period of time. This is a new claim that they issued as part of their 1998 exclusive economic zone law, when they first sort of staked out when they first passed a formal law illustrating the limits of their exclusive economic zone. They had a provision in there that says that none of this shall affect China's historic rights. And so, in other words, what their basic position seems to be is that they claim the sovereignty over the features, the zones around them, and around some sort of hypothetical baselines in the Spratlys. And then they also claim historic rights in the South China Sea. Now, how a lot of Southeast Asian countries view this is that there are a number of problems with this. First of all, Vietnam and the Philippines reject the idea of that these islands in the South China Sea should be entitled to full 200 nautical mile EEZs. And indeed, the 2016 arbitration award that Michael referred to also rejected that claim. The logic being that these islands are so small that they shouldn't be entitled to such wide maritime zones. And they're uninhabited. They've largely been uninhabited continuously, and to the extent they're inhabited today, it's only because they get support from supplies being shipped in. And so they shouldn't be entitled to those 200-mile zones, just a 12-mile territorial sea. And that furthermore, you shouldn't be able to treat them as a unit with baselines around there. a quick note on that, there are a lot of countries. China's not the only one to treat islands as a unit. Many countries, including Argentina, the United Kingdom, Australia, not just U.S. adversaries, including some U.S. allies, do treat offshore island groups as a unit and draw baselines around them. But usually that's not in such a contentious area where there's so much sovereignty disputes over the underlying islands, and where there's a lot of overlap with the exclusive economic zones that are extending from the neighboring mainland states or continental states. So this is where, of course, Vietnam and the Philippines, because they're closer to the Spratly Islands and they have continental shelves and exclusive economic zones that extend into this area, they really object to China trying to use these small islands to claim such an expansive area of ocean space, especially these historic rights, when it's not even clear what China means by historic rights. And this is the point I'll just conclude on, is that a lot of times China's claims are described in terms of this 9-dash line. But in actuality, over the last decade or so, China's distanced itself from the 9-dash line and instead has turned more to these international legal concepts, some of which are contested, like I mentioned, the historic rights concept and these straight baselines around these groups. But they don't really rely much on that 9-dash line anymore. Of course, they haven't fully repudiated it, but they're really trying to rely on these other legal concepts. And China's not unique in trying to use the law of the sea to promote its interests. This is a phenomenon, around the world. But what this means in practical terms, and why many Southeast Asian countries object to it, is that China is effectively trying to use its interpretations of international law to claim rights and enforcement jurisdiction throughout this entire region, which is a concern when they also have these sovereignty claims and these resource claims. And so that's really where a lot of these disputes stem from. Now, from the last point on when it comes to freedom of navigation, which is usually the catchphrase the United States uses when it's talking about these disputes, or rules-based order, China hasn't actually impeded commercial navigation. Of course, they are growing the capability to do so, especially as they build up their presence in these islands in the Spratlys. If there were a conflict, they could use their enhanced presence to threaten commerce. But China depends upon free flow of commerce through the South China Sea almost more than any other country, and so they really haven't threatened that. But what they do object to is the frequency of U.S. military activities, especially the freedom of navigation operations that go right next to these disputed features. And so that is really where the sort of core of the dispute between the United States lies, is over sort of the frequency of U.S. Military operations in this area. And they're not even objecting to U.S. military navigation through the main channels of the South China Sea, but really when it comes to the sensitive areas near their naval bases and Hainan Island or near these disputed waters, that's really where the core of the U.S.-China dispute emerges, separate from these other disputes that China has with Southeast Asian countries. So I'll leave it at that, and I can share more on my views on these issues as we get further into this discussion.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for being very disciplined on your time. Excellent. And next up is Alex. Alex, please.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'm gonna focus on Chinese strategy in the South China Sea, and then we'll discuss the pathways to conflict mitigation in the region. So let me share my screen. All right. Can you see it? Can you see my screen?
Yep, can see it.
Okay. Okay, so a strategy consists of 3 components, end, ways, and means. And so for China, the end outcome that China wants to achieve in the South China Sea is the dominance of the sea. It tries to achieve that goal, but not by through major battles, but by gradually shifting the strategic configuration, the Chinese notion of of the strategic configuration of the region through opportunistic expansion and gray zone operations. the notion of shi is very central to Chinese strategic culture. It's very hard to translate into English, but according to this notion, the situation has a strategic disposition or propensity, and if one can change the shi of the situation, the strategic disposition or propensity of things, of a situation, one can win without fighting. So the idea of shi underlies a lot of the work in Chinese strategic culture, like Sun Tzu Art of War, and also underlying the very popular Chinese board game called Wei Qi by the Chinese or Go by the Japanese, which literally translates as the board game of encirclement. So China can, tries to change the strategic configuration or strategic disposition of the South China Sea, like slicing Islami. And so the tactic is what we call Islami slicing. And the means China used to conduct this way includes the People's War at Sea, which emphasizes the use of non-military forces and paramilitary forces like the maritime militia, or the three warfares, which include public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, or legal warfare, and so on and so forth. One example of China's strategy in the South China Sea is the way China seized the western group of the Paracel Island from South Vietnam in 1974 that Rachel just mentioned. 1974 is the year after the Congress, U.S. Congress banned the United States from militarily intervening in Indochina, in Vietnam. And so taking advantage of that power vacuum, the Chinese went down to try to seize the western group of the South China Sea, which was at that time occupied by South Vietnam, a dying regime because they were involved in big battles in Indochina with communist forces from the north of Vietnam. And China used fishermen or soldiers camouflaged or masqueraded as fishermen to collect intelligence and conduct reconnaissance, and then engage in a small battle with the dying South Vietnamese Navy to seize the whole western group of these Paracel Islands. The same pattern took place again in 1988 when China went down to the Spratly Islands and seized 6 reefs in the Spratly Islands. So China also used fishermen or soldiers masqueraded as fishermen for intelligence and reconnaissance. And then, for example, when China occupied Fiery Cross Reef, the excuse was China wanted to just set up a weather station on that. And again, in the late 1994 and early 1995, when China stealthily occupied Mischief Reef, which lies within the Philippines EEZ, and China first planted some sovereign markers in there and built a wooden structure masqueraded as shelter for fishermen. The Philippines had a plan to threaten to destroy the structure, but eventually dropped the plan, and so no battles or no clash took place. However, 20 years later, Mischief became a massive artificial islands with a long runway and deep water harbor. The Chinese strategy in the South China Sea entails 4 major imperatives. The first imperative is to avoid war and initiate clashes only to exploit favorable circumstances. For example, when China saw a power vacuum in 1974, a power vacuum in 1988. 1988 was only 2 years after Soviet leader Gorbachev announced a new sea change in Soviet foreign policy. He advocates for a common house in Asia, and he tries to reconciliate with the PRC and the United States. And also the Soviet Union drastically reduced its military and economic aid to Vietnam and withdraw from Southeast Asia. And then 1994, 1995, when China seized Mischief Reef, stealthily, it was just a little over 2 years, more than 2 years after the Philippines terminated U.S. bases on the Philippines. And the second imperative is to control the most strategically located territories and seize them stealthily if possible, or in limited conflict if necessary. So we have seen that the ways China seized the Paracel Islands and all of the 7 reefs in the Spratly Islands, but also Scarborough Shoal. China now in the Spratly Islands occupied only 7 reefs, less than the number of reefs occupied by the Philippines. Philippines occupied 9 reefs, and Vietnam occupied 21 reefs. But with the exception of 1 reef, which is Hill's Reef, 6 of the 7 reefs occupied by China are more strategically located than most of the reefs occupied by the Philippines and Vietnam. And then the third imperative is to develop them into hubs of logistics, port, and staging bases from which to dominate the waters and skies of the South China Sea. We have seen that with the artificial islands, long runways, deep water harbors that China has built in the last couple of years. And then the fourth imperative is to spread a narrative of China's historical right in the South China Sea, and a narrative that China is reactive to the provocations of others, but China is fearless of others' provocations. This narrative is reflected in any statement of China about the South China Sea dispute. One example is right after the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in 2016, China rented a huge screen at Times Square to show a video which says that, for example, here in this picture, China is the first to have continuously, peacefully, and effectively exercised sovereignty and jurisdiction over Nanhai Chiudao, the South China Sea Islands, and relevant waters. Talking about strategic triangles, so you can see here 2 artificial islands that China has built in the Spratly Islands, Subi Reef and Mischief Reef. The size so big, they are no longer tiny reefs. They are massive artificial islands, as big as Pearl Harbor or Washington, D.C. And the 5 white circles that you can see in here are the land features that China effectively controlled right now in the South China Sea, from which we can see it's a perfect places for China to dominate the skies and waters in the South China Sea. Of the 5 white circles here, 4 are actually, there are right now 4 long runways in the middle of the South China Sea, and they are all controlled by China. Woody Island up north in the Paracel Island, and Subi Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, and Mischief Reef down south in the Spratly Islands. And Scarborough Reef was the Scarborough Shoal is the 5th one, where China has not built any structure. However, if the Mischief scenario replicates itself, then we can see something in the next decade or so. This is the sort of chronology of China's expansion in the South China Sea, and you can see here the use of opportunistic expansion and gray zone operations. So basically, it's we can see that one of the central feature of the conflict in the South China Sea is that in the last 4 decades is that it occurred in the gray zone between war and peace. And conflict mitigation in the gray zone has some peculiarities, which I'm going to show here. There are two pathways to conflict mitigation in the gray zone. One way is when both sides escalate to a point where they both de-escalate. The reason is because neither side wants war. And so one example is the oil rig crisis between China and Vietnam in 2014, when China unilaterally deployed a giant oil rig into water which lies within the Vietnamese side of the median line between the Hainan Island coast and the Vietnamese coast. And so crossing the Vietnamese red line, Vietnam sent Coast Guard ships and fisheries surveillance, basically law enforcement ships, to the scene to confront China. China also sent law enforcement ships to the scene to protect their oil rig, but neither side sent Navy ships to the scene. So they Vietnam also escalates the conflict in terms of allowing protests at home in Vietnam. Protests broke out throughout Vietnam in major cities until some protesters killed Chinese nationals and burned factories which they thought are Chinese. Actually, they were Taiwanese. And Vietnam also brought the case to the United Nations and brought international journalists to the scene to see what happened on the ground. And after 75 days, China unilaterally withdrew their oil rig 1 month before the schedule. So that's one way to conflict mitigation. And the other way is very much asymmetric, with one side pressured into unilateral de-escalation through mainly psychological warfare in combination with the weaponization of non-military things like trade or so. And here in this very important, I think it's worth noting the concept of risk fear. China is very adept at risk fear, and my colleague Jonathan Odom has written about China's risk fear in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Basically, risk fear is the deliberate use of risk that plays on the other side's fear of escalation, because the fear of escalation tends to spread more freely and more openly in open society and smaller countries. So China has a clear advantage in risk fear. So let me stop here and turn the mic over to Michael.
Great, Alex. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for staying in the time limit. And finally, as I said earlier, last but not least, Greg, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to try to bring us up to the current day. So what I really want to focus on is, where we find ourselves vis-a-vis South China Sea tensions in April 2021. The biggest question that I was asked last year, I think understandably, was whether or not we had seen any de-escalation in the South China Sea as a result of COVID. And there was very good reason to believe, at least in the early days of the pandemic, that that's what would happen, that as the region and China both grappled with this, once in a generation global crisis, that there would be an urge to set aside other things. And unfortunately, we now know, looking back, the data that didn't happen. So first, to set the scene, where do we find ourselves? at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, as Rachel said, when we talk about the South China Sea, we're really talking about two different sets of disputes. We have the territorial dispute, which she laid out very well, on which everybody outside the region, including the US, it has been very clearly neutral for the better part of a century now. And then we have the maritime dispute over the rules of the road, who gets oil and gas resources and fishing resources, what are law enforcement and military rights, and so on. And into this, as Rachel said, since the 90s, we've had China's claim of historic rights, clearly muddying the water. So what exactly it is that Beijing claims, and to a lesser degree what it is that Taipei claims, remains unclear. Since 1995, as a result, we've had the US pretty steadily arguing along the same lines, that it doesn't really care how the disputes are resolved, so long as it is peacefully, so that we don't get dragged into a conflict involving our treaty ally, the Philippines, and so long as it doesn't impact the freedom of the seas and the rights of third parties. And in 1998, as Rachel said again, with the Declaration of Historic Rights in China's EEZ law, what exactly freedom of the seas means in the South China Sea has become a very contested issue. Now, it remained a contested issue, but one that was largely punted for years until the aftermath of the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012, which both Rachel and Alex referred to. So China, in a month-long standoff with the Philippines, ends up in de facto control of Scarborough Shoal, though it hasn't built on it. The Philippines responds by filing this arbitration case in early 2013. And that seems to be what convinces the new government of Xi Jinping to greenlight this long-mooted plan to expand Chinese facilities in the Spratlys. So this is what Mischief Reef looked like in 2012. Alex, again, talked about how Mischief Reef was the last of China's islands occupied. I'm using island very loosely. There is nothing above water at Mischief Reef. And so Mischief Reef was a reef belonging to the continental shelf of the Philippines up until really 2015. This is Mischief Reef today. So of China's 7 features in the Spratly Islands, now there is 3,200 acres of dry land that didn't exist before. And we don't need to go through the catalog of everything that's been built on them, but suffice to say that as a result of this construction, by really 2015, 2016, we had seen, I think, a fundamental shift in the prioritization of the South China Sea disputes, particularly in Washington and Tokyo and Canberra and elsewhere, as China's ability to assert its claims shifted very dramatically, right? So it was one thing for China to claim historic rights 1,000 miles from its shore when it didn't really have the capability to do anything about it. When Beijing suddenly has 3 air and naval bases 800 miles from shore in the Spratly Islands, that changes things. Today, China sees every vessel that moves on the South China Sea. It sees every plane that moves above the South China Sea. It maintains at least a dozen large Coast Guard vessels on patrol 24/7 at symbolic reefs, as well as its own bases in the southern edges of the South China Sea. And it maintains a militia force of several hundred in the Spratly Islands. So the visibility, the persistence of Chinese presence has changed. That's where we stand at the end of 2019. As the pandemic's breaking out, Beijing has begun to steadily increase the rotational deployment of Navy, Coast Guard, paramilitary vessels. We see military patrol aircraft, AWACS last year landing on these islands for the first time. Everything except fighter jets has gone into the Spratlys, and the Southeast Asians are at a really laughable disadvantage by the end of 2019. Over the course of 2020, as the pandemic breaks out, rather than de-escalate on the military front, we actually see Beijing increasing its military signaling. So this is a map of Chinese military activities. We published a similar one of the US. US activities were largely flat in the South China Sea in 2020. In fact, they decreased in the spring after the Theodore Roosevelt was stricken with COVID. The amount of military signaling from Beijing, though, increased substantially last year. Now, this is not a perfect parallel to how many ship days the PLA Navy spent in the South China Sea, but when you scrape through all the press releases, it's very clear that China wanted to be seen as more present in the South China Sea. It spent far more time talking about its naval activities, its missile exercises, et cetera, in the South China Sea. That is one part of the strategy, making clear that Beijing is both dominant in ISR capabilities, missile capabilities, naval capabilities, and has a greater willingness to stand up to pressure than one might have expected. And I think this is largely reflective of the hypersensitivity to criticism and the nationalist and strident turn we saw among Chinese diplomats last year. As they faced international criticism about COVID, one of the areas they reacted in was with a more strident doubling down on claims, both in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in Ladakh, on the Indian border, and so on. But for Southeast Asians, the most important shift isn't naval. And I think for China, as Alex said, the number one goal is to avoid conflict. So the real goal of the islands isn't to forward deploy massive amounts of PLA Navy vessels. It's what it allows China to do in the gray zone with law enforcement and militia vessels. So as the pandemic was first hitting the news, emerging from Wuhan at the end of December, what we were simultaneously seeing was the deployment of a Chinese fishing flotilla of about 40 vessels that sailed out of Hainan at the beginning of December 2019 and spent the next 6 weeks operating off the coast of Malaysia and Indonesia in the waters that China has been calling the Southwest fishing grounds since the late 1980s. And the way we tracked the flotilla wasn't by tracking the fishing boats, it was by tracking the Coast Guard escorts. There were 6 to 7 Chinese Coast Guard boats protecting the fishing flotilla every day. And as with most Chinese Coast Guard activities in the South China Sea, they are very careful to keep what's called their AIS transponders on. They want everybody in the region to know that they're there. That's the whole point. The assertion of sovereignty requires flying the flag, letting the Southeast Asians know that, yeah, the China's Coast Guard is off your shores, and there's not a thing you can do about it. I mentioned the daily patrols at symbolically important reefs. So it's not just China's islands that have seen an increase in Coast Guard patrols. It's areas that China doesn't physically occupy. We've talked about Scarborough Shoal, where nothing has been built, and yet there is a de facto Chinese presence every single day, a combination of both Coast Guard and militia, and that's been the case since 2012. More problematic really has been the pretty striking increase in the amount of pressure placed on the Filipinos at Second Thomas Shoal, where there is at least one and usually 2 Chinese Coast Guard boats patrolling every single day. This is where in 1999, the Philippines intentionally grounded a old World War II era tank landing ship in reaction to the seizure of Mr. Freef. Luconia Shoals off the coast of Malaysia, which is unoccupied, but sits in the middle of important oil and gas fields for Malaysia, has seen a Chinese Coast Guard presence almost continually since the end of 2013, and that too has increased. And then Vanguard Bank, after a series of increasing standoffs with Vietnam started in 2017, and capping off with a 4-month standoff involving up to 100 boats from each side at the end of 2019, we've seen China since mid-2020 establish a new patrol route at Vanguard Bank, where there's been a Chinese Coast Guard ship operating at Vanguard Bank every day for almost a year now. Those numbers were up amid COVID, not down. So just comparing a 12-month period in 2019 to a 12-month period in 2020 at each of these locations, you can see that the persistence of Chinese patrols increased substantially at the same time that its neighbors were dealing with this pandemic. The place it's been most visible is on oil and gas. I won't go through the details of each oil and gas standoff we've seen over the last couple of years, but last year, the one that really caught international attention was this standoff involving the West Capella drilling ship off Malaysia, which actually began its operations in December 2019. But the standoff with the China Coast Guard lasted for 6 months. So as soon as the West Capella drilling ship began drilling in blocks ND1 and ND2 that you see there, the Chinese Coast Guard ship that was on the regular Luconia Shoals patrol, Haijing 5203, showed up and started patrolling around the drilling ship. This went on every day for 6 months. And what we saw was the same thing we saw off the coast of Vietnam at Vanguard Bank just a few months earlier, that Chinese Coast Guard ships don't really target the drilling rig. You know, nobody wants to cause a massive oil spill in an international incident. Chinese Coast Guard ships target the offshore supply vessels that service these rigs. As Alex said, it's about risk fare, making it prohibitively risky and expensive for civilians to operate in contested waters. So if you are Petronas, a state-owned oil company in Malaysia, or Shell, or Rosneft off Vietnam, it's getting harder and harder to find contractors willing to service rigs because they know that every single day they have to deal with the high-stakes game of chicken involving the Chinese Coast Guard. Here's a pretty standard shot of what that standoff looked like on one day, and I would just draw your attention to the supply vessel. So the West Capella is a drilling ship. Supply vessel is a small Malaysian civilian vessel. The Haijing 5305 is a Chinese Coast Guard ship headed straight for its bow. And this happened over and over and over. Now, of course, the 5305 doesn't intend to strike that vessel. It intends to force that vessel to veer off. It intends to scare it, and it intends to make sure that it's going to think twice before coming back to take a new contract with the Malaysians. To its credit, KL, Kuala Lumpur, didn't back down. And so as a result, we saw China do the same thing to Malaysia it did to Vietnam just 6 months earlier. It responded by deploying its own survey vessel to go operate off the coast of Malaysia. So for the last month of the standoff, the Hayang Dijir 8, a state-owned survey ship, went down and began surveying in the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia, protected by a group of Chinese maritime militia vessels. These aren't Coast Guard ships. These are Chinese fishing boats that came down from Hainan to protect the vessel, making sure that the Malaysian law enforcement ships that tried to interdict it couldn't get close enough to stop the incident. So as I said, that was the most public, most widely reported example. That wasn't the only example of oil and gas standoffs during COVID. We saw another one in Malaysia in November 2020 involving another rig operated by the Thai state-owned company, PTT. And here is an example of how the Malaysians tried to respond to that, basically just following the China Coast Guard around, asking them to pretty please leave, which went on for quite a while and happens pretty regularly now off the coast of Malaysia. And then, as I said, there's a new patrol route around Vanguard Bank, where there is basically a Chinese Coast Guard ship operating every single day around the Russian drilling rigs at Vanguard Bank, trying to make life difficult. And one of the nice things about this is it shows you how the ability to go resupply at Fiery Cross Reef, one of the air and naval bases in the Spratlys, facilitates this. It makes it so the Chinese ships don't have to go back to the Chinese coast 800 miles away anymore. They can just be forward deployed in the Spratlys. Second thing to talk about is the maritime militia, the so-called third force here. So China, and I'm not using figurative language here. The Chinese Law and Military Service of 1982 requires men who leave service to sign up with the militia. As Alex said, in 74 and 88, generally what you saw in South China Sea operations were civilian fishermen who happened to be on the militia rolls who would get called up for weekend service to ferry supplies or soldiers out to engage in ISR. This was pretty standard. It's also basically what Vietnam's own maritime militia looks like. But over the last decade or so, we've seen a professionalization of a subset of this militia, these so-called vanguard units in places like Tanmen in Hainan, Dianbai, Maoming in Guangtian, and in Guangzhou, and most especially on Sansha itself and Woody Island in the Paracels, where you have these very well-heeled fishing vessels that have been built with state subsidies or paid for to almost entirely operate as militia units, almost never fishing. And in some cases, as far as we can tell, they don't know how to fish. Their numbers have steadily increased in the Spratlys with the completion of the air and naval bases, so that by the end of 2018, we were seeing about 300 ships operating every single day. This was seen most spectacularly when the Filipinos decided to start some repair work at their big island, T2, at the end of 2018. And the same day they started repairing their island, we see about 95, I think there's 95 in that picture, Chinese militia boats pour out of Subi Reef, which is nearby, drop anchor within 2 miles of T2 Island, and they've been there every day, 2.5 years now and counting. Here they are just last month. There's about 40 boats in that picture operating on T2 reefs. The Filipinos, to their credit, kept it up, but this again is about raising the risk. Every time the Filipinos want to access this island now, they have to run a gauntlet of sometimes 30, 40, 100 Chinese militia boats. The same thing we are now seeing at Whitsun Reef over the last month and a half. It's not that China wants to pick a fight. It's that it wants to make it prohibitively difficult for the Southeast Asians to operate. This is the gray zone strategy. And the best that the Filipinos seem to have come up with is that they're going to go out there and take pictures of these boats and hope that that somehow raises cost on China. But clearly in a vacuum, that isn't going to change much of anything. And I think I'll wrap up there. I look forward to talking about what our options might be about all of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. And thank you to the other two speakers for staying right within the limits. So as I said, first, let's have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves about the issues that we've just talked about. And I guess for me, one basic question here, when you think about the United States and its involvement in this area, is, what are U.S. interests here? I mean, we hear the standard sort of rules-based order, freedom of navigation, non-use of force. All of those things are mentioned by U.S. officials quite frequently in talking about this. But I'd like to hear from all three of you what your view is of what you think the most important threats are posed by behavior by the Chinese and by others in their contesting back and forth in this area. And do you think that the issue of China's growing influence and presence is a kind of war or peace issue for the United States? I mean, is the threat that high for the US? And if it's not, then what do you think the threat is? Maybe Rachel, could you start with any comments on that?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to Alex and Greg for your presentations. Those were both really informative. On this core issue, I think that, you know, the reality is that the South China Sea issue has really taken an excess amount of attention in Washington over the last decade relative to U.S. interests. And I think it's because in part it sort of represents the shift in the balance of power that's taken place over that time period between the United States and China and the Western Pacific. And you know, as I mentioned in my presentation, the United States doesn't take a position on sovereignty over these islands. And you know, from China's perspective, the activities they're engaging in are legitimate because they're defending their sovereign rights and interests. Now, of course, the issue I think is that China, these are of course disputed, and that Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia and other countries in the region, you know, have those same convictions about their sovereign rights. But since we don't take a position on the underlying sovereignty dispute, we don't really have, you know, a stake in the actual disputes over resources and over territory. What our interests are in the region are basically that these disputes are resolved peacefully, that they don't escalate into conflict, especially involving our ally, the Philippines, that's involved in these disputes, and that these countries are able to achieve mutually agreeable compromises, if not, you know, a final resolution of the underlying disputes, at least provisional measures that enable them to prevent them from, you know, escalating into conflict. And actually, to the credit of Xi Jinping and Duterte, they have sought this path over the last several years. China, you know, under their leadership, China and the Philippines have sought to negotiate shared compromises over how to exploit the resources in contested waters. And you know, those have been somewhat fraught. Those haven't been fully implemented, but I think more of those types of arrangements between China and other countries, or between Vietnam and Malaysia, you know, again, we oftentimes focus on these disputes as being China versus all the rest, but it's oftentimes more complex than that, and that some of these countries have their own disputes with one another. And ultimately, you know, a broader code of conduct for the region can help to stabilize these disputes as well. So I think that's really the core US interest in these disputes, is just the stabilization of the disputes and the prevention of conflict. And then when it comes to navigation, of course, we have an interest in navigating both commercially and military through the South China Sea. But I think this is where, if we can understand that navigation is not really at risk in these disputes, I think that helps us to clarify what, you know, U.S. interests are. And unfortunately, I think the way the rhetoric around freedom of navigation is deployed in this context in Washington, oftentimes it suggests that China's threatening freedom of navigation, when it really isn't. Outside of these disputes themselves, where, you know, it objects to the resource extraction that other countries are doing in areas where it perceives that those resources belong to it. Again, those claims may be excessive, but it's not actually impeding just regular navigation through the South China Sea as a strategic sea line of communication. It's objecting to the resource exploitation, or it's objecting to U.S. military operations, you know, near those islands or near China's coast. So it's not really, you know, it's not saying the United States can't pass through these waters. It's not trying to sort of go beyond its jurisdiction in that regard. So I think that we do have strategic interests, but they're less threatened and less expansive than we traditionally think of them.
Okay, Thank you, Rachel. Alex, what's your view on this? U.S. interests and the threats that are posed by this situation?
Yeah, thank you. I think the major threat in the South China Sea to the United States, but not just to the United States, but also to most maritime nations in the world is Chinese domination of the sea. We have seen that China has built artificial islands in the South China Sea strategically, and all of the major runways and deep water harbors in the middle of the sea are controlled by the Chinese, and China is now poised to dominate the sea. But I would note that Chinese dominance of the sea is not similar to U.S. dominance of like Caribbean Sea or some other maritime areas in the world, because this domination with Chinese characteristics. And the Chinese characteristics here is that China exposed a notion of closed sea, the notion of China is talking about the waters within the 9-dash line. The China claims in the South China Sea as blue national soil. So China would treat the maritime domain as if it is China's territory, and China would impose its domestic laws and regulations on the sea. Secondly, China is trying to replace the rules-based order in international relations with its own hierarchical order. So the way China treats Southeast Asian countries, the way China, advance in the South China Sea is to replace rules-based order with the hierarchical order, where everybody has to acknowledge China's superior position, supreme position in the hierarchy of nations, and so can behave according to the position. So we have seen that in China's interception of U.S. ships and U.S. aircraft in the South China Sea, but also China, for example, in 2017, China intercepted a UUV unmanned underwater vehicle by the United States outside of this 9-dash line, very close to the Philippine coast. So let me stop here. I think basically just Chinese domination of the South China Sea, and this is an imposition of the idea of closed sea on the idea of open sea, which is the idea of the UNCLOS, and also the replacement of the rules-based international order with a hierarchical order in which China stays at the top.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Greg, do you have some comments on this before we turn to the questions from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the U.S. has two sets of interests in the South China Sea, and that they've been pretty consistent. At least they've been consistent. What has changed, I think, has been the South China Sea itself. So since the 30s, U.S. officials have consistently said that they want to see all of their allies, not attacked in the South China Sea. And for a while, that was the ROC and the Philippines and South Vietnam. Today, it's just the Philippines. But as Rachel said, I think the top concern of the U.S. is preventing violence that might draw the U.S. in through the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines. And I mean, the flip side of that is not being seen to abandon the Philippines in order to avoid that. That has obviously become more salient as China's reach and actual ability to threaten the Philippines has grown over the years. And then the second is this question of freedom of the seas. And I do agree with Rachel that the idea of commercial navigation being interfered with in the South China Sea has been a red herring and much overdone. The U.S. has been concerned about freedom of the seas writ large since Jefferson sent the Marines against the Barbary States. What's changed is that the South China Sea was never seen as threatening freedom of the seas until the 1990s, until China's claim via the 9-dash line began to expand. There is no U.S. statement about freedom of the seas being threatened until 95. And so that is a much tougher nut to crack, because it doesn't present a casus belli, but it's not something the U.S. can just walk away from, because if China can claim 1,000 miles of historic rights, then why can't everybody? How do you have a regime of international law if it doesn't apply to China at all?
Great, thanks. We have not that much time left, about 10 minutes, so I'm kind of hesitant to keep going among us because I'm sure we have a lot of questions. In fact, I can see we do have a lot of questions. And one of them is there anything that the Southeast Asian nations can do collectively to deal with China? I mean, this is a common sort of belief or assumption that the Southeast Asian nations really need to unify their position more. And as Rachel said, they really disagree with each other on these issues of who owns what. I mean, the Vietnamese claim all of the land features in the South China Sea as the Chinese do. So I guess the question is there anything that Southeast Asian countries as a whole and ASEAN perhaps can do to try to develop more stability in this region? They have been engaged in discussions with the Chinese now since before 2002, where you had the declaration on behavior in the South China Sea at that time, and then efforts ever since then to have a kind of formal code of conduct among the states in the area. So does anybody have comments on whether you think the Southeast Asian countries should have a stronger role and be able to exercise influence in this? Or how do you think this code of conduct is going to develop? And anybody is completely done.
I'm happy to start. I mean, you're right that this idea of an ASEAN-China Code of Conduct has been a pursuit of ASEAN since 1995, and the Philippines was tasked to draft the first version for ASEAN in '98, I think. And if you compare the single draft negotiating text that was leaked in 2018 to the version that was signed in 2002, nobody has moved an inch. I mean, if anything, the positions have hardened. So ASEAN has not made any progress, and neither has China in 3 decades. That said, of course, Southeast Asian states have to have the foremost agency here. This isn't something the U.S. can solve. The U.S. can't draw boundaries in the South China Sea. I think what's ultimately needed is a parallel track here by the Southeast Asians in which they negotiate general rules of the road through ASEAN, but negotiate kind of minilaterally among themselves and then with China on things like fisheries management, oil and gas, joint development, because why would you ask Laos to stick its neck out over fisheries resources off the Indonesian coast? Again, China's not going to do that. And it's silly to ask. There's no issue in the history of the last 50 years that was politically sensitive that ASEAN solved. And it's not going to start with the South China Sea.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, let me move on to another question. It's a question about the freedom of navigation operations and what U.S. freedom of navigation and maybe perhaps other countries' freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea and military exercises as well. What's your general characterization about what role these things play in stabilizing the region? Now, obviously, freedom of navigation is for the U.S. point of view and that of other countries who engage in these things is part of their efforts to try to assert what they regard as the correct interpretation of maritime law. Or I should put it more accurately, what they regard as the incorrect assertion of maritime law on the part of other countries. But is this freedom of navigation operations, is it a stabilizing thing for the region? Is it destabilizing? Is it neutral? What's your view on this?
Maybe I'll jump in on this. I think one thing that's important to remember with freedom of navigation operations is that this is a program by the United States, primarily executed by the U.S. Navy, though not exclusively, and it accompanies diplomatic and consultation efforts by the State Department. Right? It's part of a broader effort to try to promote U.S. understandings of international law of the sea. Now, this means that these are used not only to target China's claims, but to target claims of basically all the Southeast Asian countries as well. And my argument is that what this actually highlights is that the United States really is at variance with the legal maritime claims of a lot of countries in Asia. And in fact, in my research, I've found that every single coastal state in Asia disagrees with the United States on at least some component of the law of the sea. And this includes the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam and Malaysia and a lot of these countries that that are involved in these disputes, not only China. And yet over the last decade or so, we have increasingly used freedom of navigation operations not only to target those excessive maritime claims, what the United States views as excessive, but also to send strategic signals against China in those disputes. And so, I think that, yes, some other countries have occasionally conducted these operations, but no one has a sort of formalized freedom of navigation program like the US. And it's my view that actually these operations, especially with how frequent they've become, aren't really doing that much good for the United States. And in fact, they're actually serving to destabilize the situation in the South China Sea. And this is in part because we've sort of conflated or mixed up the original purpose of these operations, which was to make a legal point, with a more strategic purpose that they're supposedly playing. And I think that has not been helpful, because it's sort of they're not meant to make a strategic point. So it just kind of reveals the US to be relatively impotent, because we're conducting these operations and it's not really changing US behavior. So I think that's strategically ineffective. But then even on the underlying legal purpose of these operations, legal scholars have different attitudes on this. And there are those who argue that it's actually not necessary to conduct these operations that formally, violate other countries' excessive claims. You can just, indicate diplomatically that you object to them, and then maybe occasionally do an operation at variance, but you don't need to be doing it on a quarterly basis or even an annual basis. And if you take a step back and look at the fact that we're sort of using unilateral military operations to object to countries' excessive maritime claims all throughout Asia, it's sort of, when we haven't even ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's somewhat of a sense, it betrays a sense of entitlement that as power balances shift in the region, really, I think, put yourself in Vietnam's shoes or in Malaysia's shoes or in China's shoes. If, a foreign military were seeking to sort of push back on your maritime claims in this way, I think there's better ways that we could go about promoting our legal interpretations through diplomacy, and even achieving compromises on some of these contentious issues where, we disagree with allies and adversaries alike. And I think that would be a more stabilizing approach than military operations.
Thanks, Rachel. Any other comments on this point from Greg or Alex, or shall I move on to another question?
I'll just say I generally agree with Rachel. I think that we should stop putting out a press release every time we do a FONOP. I think that's been wildly unhelpful. They should go back to being the niche legal tools that they were prior to October 2015.
Same here. I also agree with you. I think FONOP is a good tactic to show our U.S. commitment to freedom of the sea, but it's a bad strategy.
Well, we're getting far too much agreement here, you guys, which is great, actually, to some extent. I mean, you're looking at the problem in somewhat similar ways, which I think is important if we can get these kind of messages out. But I guess the basic question, in the very little time we have left here, is where do we go from here? I mean, where do you think the US should really exert its greatest efforts as a strategy in trying to protect its interests and those of its allies in the South China Sea? And when you look at the broader picture of the Indo-Pacific and the rivalry between the US and China, the South China Sea has a real potential for acting as a kind of representative example of strategic competition that could lead to some very bad outcomes for all countries involved. So what would be your sort of baseline? You had 30 seconds in the elevator with the president, and you wanted to really argue for what US policy could do to improve this situation. What would you say? Greg?
I think you've got to do two things. In the short term, you've got to fix the US-Philippine alliance. It's your oldest alliance in Asia. It's on the ropes. If the Filipinos are going to be able to maintain access to their own waters long enough to pursue some kind of long-term diplomatic strategy, then they need much more US assistance. And the US, on that long-term diplomatic strategy, should really put itself in the mold of kind of bad cop. I think the US and the whole international community, Europe, Australia, Japan, should be publicizing, naming and shaming, imposing more diplomatic costs on China, so that this issue becomes a pain. And when the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia take compromises to China, Beijing's actually somewhat interested in taking them. Because right now, I don't think Beijing has any interest whatsoever in compromising the South China Sea, because it pays no cost.
Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the U.S. strategies in the South China Sea should revolve around redressing the imbalance of power right now in South China Sea. Right now we have imbalance of power. China is poised to dominate the skies and the waters in the region, and that is as I said, threatening to the open sea notion that underlies UNCLOS. And so the United States can do a lot of things to redress the imbalance, to establish a equilibrium of power. For example, we can strengthen our relationship or our partnership with Philippines and Vietnam, and we have to cooperate with them so that we can have more access to their coastal places, and we have to increase our presence in the region. So I think one of the key things is the United States need to refrain from acting as an honest broker between China and the smaller countries in Southeast Asia. That, I think, it would be a strategic mistake. We have seen the United States acted as an honest broker between the Philippines and China over this Scarborough Shoal, and the end outcome was Chinese de facto control of the Scarborough Shoal. So,
right. Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Rachel, do you have a comment on this very briefly? We're really almost, yeah, we are over time now. So,
well, just, yeah, I think this is where maybe we do have stronger disagreements on the panel. And I think that it's instructive to think of how China is viewing this issue. And I think one thing we haven't described in this panel yet is that China has this sort of contradictory and counterintuitive strategic mindset toward the South China Sea, where yes, it's increasingly trying to exercise dominance along the lines that Gregory and Alex have outlined, and yet it also has somewhat of a siege or victim mentality, where it perceives itself as engaging in defensive activities to protect its own Haiyang-Chanyi, its own maritime rights and interests. And this is a sort of noxious mix, but what it means is that whenever China feels like it's being opposed, and especially by an outside power like the United States, it doubles down in its position. And it does things like land reclamation, where it really sort of seeks to use it as an opportunity to expand its dominance, to push back against what it feels like other countries ganging up on it. And so what I would argue is that actually a more constructive way forward for the United States would be, in fact, to return to more of that sort of neutral position, where we're promoting compromise that's mutually accepted between China and other countries like the Philippines, like that has been pursued in recent years between those two countries, and that would be a better way forward that would stabilize those disputes, which we don't really have we don't have underlying stakes. We're not involved in those disputes, and would also then, make sure that, commercial navigation is adequately protected, because the only way that's going to be impeded is if a conflict were to break out. So that's the sort of better way to promote U.S. interests in the dispute.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much, Greg, Alex, and Rachel, for sharing your expertise and your insights today. We're unfortunately out of time. We could go on this for quite some time, I know, and I have views on this as well, but I'm the moderator and I have restrained myself. But thanks again to all of you, and also thanks to Zev, to Sarah, for their assistance in putting this on, arranging this event. And many thanks to all of you who logged on and called in today, and your excellent questions. I'm very sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we did at least touch on some of them. We know you're all busy and appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. So many thanks. Now I'll turn it back over to Zev for some final announcements.
Great, thank you, Michael, and greatly appreciate you stepping in today to moderate. It's not easy to do, especially in this virtual format. And I know that you have some strong opinions yourself on the topic. I thought you did a phenomenal job. And a huge thank you to Alex, Greg, and Rachel for joining us and providing your insight. Your slide decks were phenomenal, and all of your answers to our audience questions were great. You covered a ton of topics, and we did not have enough time to dive into everything today. But hopefully this is just the beginning of these sorts of conversations as the US and our partners in the region work more closely together. Like Michael said, we were not able to answer all of the great audience questions we received today. So if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, feel free to reach out to the US Asia Institute at USAI@usasiainstitute.org, and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues that we discussed today. We'll be continuing the Southeast Asian Focus series throughout the year, so please stay on the lookout for an invitation to our 6th installment in this. I would also like to point everyone to another event that USAI is hosting this week. On Thursday, April 22nd at 9 a.m., the U.S. Asia Institute, in partnership with Air Quality Asia, is hosting a parliamentary webinar with American legislators and parliamentarians from around the world on the climate crisis and the role that legislators can play in crafting meaningful and growth-oriented climate solutions. If you're interested in that event, you can register on our website at usasiainstitute.org/events. Just to finally close out today's session, I'd like to thank our corporate stakeholders one more time: Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, FedEx, and Walmart. So thank you again, Michael, Greg, Rachel, Alex. Really appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Seb. It was great.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.